Okay, I hope you're ready for one of my favorite chapters of the book. Kids love this chapter. It's called How to Recognize a Witch. The next evening, after my grandmother had given me my bath, she took me once again into the living room for another story. Tonight, the old woman said, I am going to tell you how to recognize a witch when you see one. Can you always be sure? I asked. No, she admitted, you can't. And that's the trouble. You can make a pretty good guess. She was dropping cigar ash all over her lap, and I really hoped she wasn't going to catch on fire before she told me how to recognize a witch. In the first place, she began, a real witch is certain always to be wearing gloves when you meet her. Surely not always, I said. What about in the summer when it's hot? Even in the summer, my grandmother said. She has to. And do you know why? Why? I asked. Because a real witch doesn't have fingernails. Instead of fingernails, she has thin, curvy claws like a cat, and she has to wear gloves to hide them. Mind you, lots of very respectable, delicate women wear long, fancy gloves, especially in the winter, so this clue doesn't really help you much. Mama used to wear gloves, I said. Well, not in the house, my grandmother said. Witches wear gloves even in the house. They can only take them off when they go to bed. How do you know all this, Grandmama? Don't interrupt, she said. Just take it all in. The second thing to remember is that a real witch is always bald. Bald? I said. Bald as a boiled egg, my grandmother answered. I was shocked. There was something indecent about a bald woman. Why are they bald, Grandmama? Don't ask me why, she snapped, but you can take it from me that not a single hair grows on a witch's head. How horrid! Disgusting, my grandmother agreed. Well, if she's bald, she's easy to spot then, I said. Oh, not at all, my grandmother admitted. A real witch always wears a wig to hide her baldness. She wears a first-class wig, too. And it's almost impossible to tell a really first-class wig from ordinary hair unless you give it a good pull to see if it comes off. Well, then that's just what I'll have to do, I said. Oh, don't be foolish, my grandmother said. You can't go around pulling at the hair of every lady you meet, even if she's wearing gloves. Just try it and see what happens. Oh, I guess that doesn't help much either, I said. None of these hints is very good on their own, my grandmother said. It's only when you put them all together that they begin to make a little sense. Mind you, my grandmother went on, these wigs do cause a rather serious problem for the witches. What problem, Grandmama? They make the scalp itch most terribly, she said. And the scalp is the part of your head, the skin that your hair grows out of. You see, when an actress wears a wig, or if you or I were to wear a wig as part of a costume, we would be putting the wig on over our own real hair. But a witch has to put it straight on her naked scalp. And the underneath part of a wig is always rough and scratchy. Oh, it sets up a frightful itch on the bald skin of the witch. It causes nasty sores all over the head. Wig rash is what the witches call it. And it doesn't just half itch. Okay, what other things must I look for to recognize a witch? I asked. Look for the nose holes, my grandmother said. Witches have slightly larger nose holes than ordinary people. The rim, that means the outside edge, of each nose hole is pink and curvy like the rim of a certain kind of seashell. Why do they have such big nose holes? I asked. For smelling with, my grandmother said. A real witch has the most amazing powers of smell. She can actually smell out a child who is standing on the other side of the street on a pitch black night. Well, she couldn't smell me, I said, because I just had a bath. Oh, yes, she could, my grandmother said. The cleaner you happen to be, the smelly you are to a witch. Well, that can't be true, I said. An absolutely clean child gives off the most ghastly stench to a witch, my grandmother said. The dirtier you are, the less you smell. But that doesn't make sense, Grandmama. Oh, yes, it does, my grandmother said. It isn't the dirt that the witch is smelling, it's you. The smell that drives a witch completely mad actually comes right out of your own skin. It comes oozing out of your skin in invisible waves. And these waves, stink waves, the witches call them, go floating through the air and hit the witch smack in her big nostrils. They send her reeling. Now, wait a minute, Grandmama. Don't interrupt, she said. The point is this. When you haven't washed for a week and your skin is covered over with dirt, then quite obviously the invisible stink waves can't come oozing out nearly as strongly. I shall never have a bath again, I said. Oh, you can have one, just not too often. Once a month is quite enough for a sensible child. Oh, it was moments like these that I loved my grandmother more than ever. Grandmama, I said, if it's a dark night, how can a witch smell the difference between a child and a grown-up? Because grown-ups don't give out stink waves. Only children do that. But I don't really give out stink waves, do I asked. I'm not giving them out at this very moment, am I? Not to me you aren't, my grandmother said. To me you're smelling like raspberries and cream, but to a witch you would be smelling absolutely disgusting. What would I be smelling of? I asked. Dog's droppings, said my grandmother. I reeled. I was stunned. Dog's droppings? I cried. I am not smelling like dog's droppings. I don't believe it. I won't believe it. What's more, my grandmother said, speaking with a touch of relish, to a witch you'd be smelling of fresh dog's droppings. That's simply not true, I cried. I know I'm not smelling of dog droppings, stale or fresh. Oh, there's no point in arguing about it. It's a fact of life, said my grandmother. I was outraged. I simply couldn't believe what my grandmother was telling me. So if you see a woman holding her nose as she passes you on the street, she went on, that woman could easily be a witch. Okay, so let's think. So witches are bald, but they wear wigs. You might see them scratching because the wig gives them wig rash. They always wear gloves because they have claws instead of nails. They have big nose holes, big nostrils that are kind of curvy and pink on the inside. And they think that kids smell like dog poop. Let's see what else Grandma has to say about witches. I decided to change the subject. Okay, tell me what else to look for in a witch, I said. The eyes, my grandmother said. Look carefully at the eyes, because the eyes of a real witch are different than yours and mine. Look in the middle of each eye where there's normally a little black dot. If she's a witch, the black dot will keep changing color. And if you look carefully, you will see fire and ice dancing right in the very center of the eye. It will send shivers running all over your skin. My grandmother leaned back in her chair and sucked away contentedly on her foul black cigar. I squatted on the floor, staring up at her, fascinated. She was not smiling. She looked deadly serious. Here's Grandmama. You can see the narrator kind of kneeling in her lap, listening. Are there other things? I asked. Of course there are other things, my grandmother said. You don't seem to understand that witches are not actually women at all. Sure, they look like women. They talk like women. And they are able to act like women. But in actual fact, they are totally different animals. They are demons in human shape. That is why they have claws and bald heads and odd noses and peculiar eyes, all of which they have to conceal or hide the best they can from the rest of the world. What else is different about them, Grandmama? The feet, she said. Witches never have toes. No toes, I cried. Then what do they have? Nothing. They just have feet, my grandmother said. The feet have square ends with no toes at all. Doesn't that make it very difficult to walk? I asked. Not at all, my grandmother said, but it does give them a small problem with their shoes. Now, all ladies love to wear small, rather pointed, fancy shoes, but a witch whose feet are very wide and square at the ends has the most awful job of squeezing her feet into those neat little pointed shoes. Why doesn't she just wear wide, comfy shoes with square ends? I asked. Well, she dare not, said my grandmother, just as she hides her baldness with a wig and her cat claws with gloves, right? She must also hide her ugly witch's feet by squeezing them into pretty shoes. Isn't that terribly uncomfortable? I asked. Extremely uncomfortable, my grandmother answered, but she has to put up with it. If she's wearing ordinary shoes, it won't help me to recognize her, now will it, Grandma? I'm afraid it won't, my grandmother said. You might possibly see her limping very slightly, but only if you watch closely. Are those the only differences then, Grandmama? There's one more, my grandmother said. Just one more. What is it, Grandmama? Their spit is blue. Blue, I cried. Not blue. Their spit can't be blue. Blue as a blueberry, she said. You don't mean it, Grandmama. No one can have blue spit. Witches can, she said. Is it like ink? I asked. Exactly, she said. They even use those old-fashioned pens that have nibs and they simply lick the nib. Can you notice the blue spit? I asked. Grandmama, if a witch was talking to me, would I be able to notice it? Only if you looked carefully, my grandmother said. Here's the bald witch with cat claws licking the end of her pen to use her blue spit like ink. If you looked very carefully, you would probably see a light bluish tinge on her teeth, but it doesn't show up much. It would if she spat, I said, which means like spit, like, which is never spit, my grandmother said. They dare not. I couldn't believe my grandmother would be lying to me. She went to church every morning of the week and she said grace before every meal. And somebody who did that would never tell lies. I was beginning to believe every word that she was telling me. So there you are, my grandmother said. That's about all I can tell you. None of it is very helpful on its own. You can still never be absolutely sure whether a woman is a witch or not just by looking at her. But if she is wearing gloves, if she has large nose holes and odd eyes and hair that looks like it just might be a wig, if she has a bluish tinge on her teeth, if she has all these things, you run like mad. Grandmama, I said, when you were a little girl, did you ever meet a witch? Once, my grandmother said, but only once. What happened? Well, I'm not going to tell you, she said. It would frighten you out of your skin and give you bad dreams. Please tell me, I begged. No, she said. Certain things are just too horrible to talk about. Does it have something to do with your missing thumb? I asked. Suddenly her old wrinkled lips shut tight as a pair of tongs, and the held that hand the cigar, which had no thumb on it, started to quiver slightly. I waited. She didn't look at me. She didn't speak. All of a sudden, she had shut herself off completely, and the conversation was finished. Good night, Grandmama, I said, rising from the floor and kissing her on the cheek. She didn't move, and I just crept out of the room and went to my bedroom. So, we have some really good signs to tell if a woman is really a witch or not. They do their best to hide it, but if you get close enough and you see a lot of these signs, Grandma's advice was to run out of there because, especially if you're a kid, the witch's goal is to squelch you, get rid of you, make you disappear. So she's telling all this to her grandson, hoping that if he ever sees these signs, he runs to safety. And when she was asked, have you ever met a witch before? And she said, once. We discovered that Grandma's missing her thumb and she doesn't want to talk about how that happened or why that happened. And the narrator as well as the reader kind of made an inference there to figure out like, oh, it was something to do with a witch. It's not good. Grandma doesn't want to talk about it. Okay, that's the end of the chapter. Join me the next time I post a recording, and it's a great one called The Grand High Witch.